Okay, this is the first video in a series on Plato. I don't know what I'm going to call this series yet. I think the name that's currently floating around in my head is I don't know, Plato off the cuff? Something like that. That's what this is. This series is going to be me as I'm rereading through Plato, as I think anyone who wants to call themselves educated in the West should do, is read Plato. Among other things. I'm not saying reading Plato is the end-all, be-all of education, but he is the foundation of thought in the West, and there's really no getting around that. And so it's good. It's good to know the foundation, and I think, I'll put a link in the description, but I forget the author's name who says, all of Western philosophy is just footnotes to Plato. But as I'm rereading through it, I thought, well, I've started this YouTube channel, and I'd like to talk about philosophy. And I'm a high school philosophy teacher. And so I thought I would do videos on the Plato that I was reading every once in a while. And I just finished, so I'm reading through it by a plan that was put together by a professor, again, whose name I don't remember. I'll put all sorts of links in the description when I remember all of these things. I'll probably do a video, just a real short one, on his schema and put it up. But in general, what I'd like to do is I'm reading through it, by this schema of what order to read his dialogues in, and I'll just pick up from there. Every time I finish with one, or if it's a long one like the Laws or the Republic, I'll break it into chunks probably. And just give you my impressions. I'm not on this series planning on, teaching a great course on Plato, but I think it's, it's worthwhile. It's like reading it with someone. If I want people to be reading Plato, and it's more enjoyable to do things, with a companion. And so here's my thoughts on First Alcibiades, one of the Platonic dialogues. And so the setting of this is Socrates, middle-aged Socrates, comes across 20-ish year old Alcibiades. And if you don't know Greek history, you read the Wikipedia article on Alcibiades, because boy is he a thing. Boy is he someone that happened in history. And if you don't know who Socrates is, you're probably going to get to know him as you read Plato. I highly recommend. Anyway, but that's the setting. It's something middle-aged Socrates talking to young Alcibiades. And he's talking to Alcibiades as Alcibiades is on his way to the proverbial meeting with the Senate, where he will say wonderful things and everyone will love him, and he'll get to lead Athens and one day conquer the world. Welcome to Alcibiades. And it's interesting. So Socrates sort of plans this whole dialogue across as an investigation onto what really should Alcibiades be doing with his life. And I think it's a great dialogue, especially for upper classmen in high school and, underclassmen in college. That sort of age range is really ripe for this one. And Socrates even says so in the dialogue. He says, people your age, 20-something-ish, Alcibiades, you're really at the right age for this. And I think that's very true. Not that people who are outside of that age shouldn't read it, but I think it's especially written for people right at that age where you realize that you could be great. Young children don't, some of them care about being great, but they don't really know what that means. But by the time you make it to high school and college, you kind of know what it means to be great. And you're at the age where you can start taking steps towards things like that. And this dialogue is for you. Socrates begins with a discussion on teachers, which is great because I love that, because being a teacher myself, I'm going to unbutton this and just get a little more comfortable. He talks about teachers, and I just like, interestingly, his discussion of what are the 2 qualifications of teachers. And he says all teachers must have 1, knowledge. I think that's fine. I think everyone can agree with that. He does bring up consensus. He says they should have consensus. And I find that interesting. The fact that they should agree. There should be concord. I think about the sciences, and I think about all these areas where there isn't consensus on a lot of things. We're still really trying to figure out a lot of stuff. Think about people who are people who pay attention to things like the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider and stuff. We didn't know if the Higgs boson really was what we thought it was for a long time. Does that mean that we shouldn't have been teaching what we thought about the Higgs boson until we, recorded one being created? I think of history teachers, we learn new things about history. I think especially, ancient history, we dig up stuff all the time that changes the way we understand what's going on. And the question comes up. According to Plato's Socrates in the first Alcibiades, should we not be teaching those things about which we don't have consensus, and we don't have the ability to have a consensus? Even if everyone agreed, we didn't really have any evidence for it other than the math says the Higgs boson has to do these things. It's great that the Higgs boson does do these things. I think it's a great victory, both for human understanding, but also, especially for the mathematicians who said, pretty sure it's got to do this. And then we found one. And it did those things. It's kind of like when we took a picture of a black hole for the first time. And it basically did all the things we thought it was supposed to be doing. It was pretty, it was very good. Or you go, I was about to say way back. Sorry. You go back, Neptune. We mathematically predicted Neptune long before we had a picture of it. And it was doing the things that we thought Neptune ought to be doing. So there's times like that. But there's also times like, we theorize about, what's a good thing that our understanding of just was completely turned around. Oh, Komodo dragons. We used to always think Komodo dragons were venomous or poisonous. One of the two. And then we found out that really they just have a bunch of awful, nasty bacteria and stuff in their mouths. And when they bite into their prey, that bacteria infects their prey. And so we were teaching that they aren't poisonous and they aren't venomous. They're not injecting anything, and they're not just sort of secreting weird stuff. And then we went and found poison in them. Like, they do have all this nasty bacteria, but wow, they still are also poisonous. And, our understanding changes. And I think there's a difference between, mathematics. We can actually know things for certain and end questions in mathematics. It is possible, actually, to prove something for sure in mathematics in a way that it's not in the natural sciences, and in a way that it's not in some philosophical endeavors. And so, yeah, absolutely, you should teach mathematics. I don't think there's any question about that. What do we do about the areas where you can't have this exact certainty? And I think that becomes a good question, especially for this right here. I mean, if this is Plato's dialogue about philosophy, specifically he's going to get into justice, should he be teaching what justice is? There isn't consensus. Socrates points this out very quickly. The people, the many, don't agree on what is and is not just. Hence, we have fights about it. And hence, people break laws. For Plato, this is a good... Things Plato said that are key to Plato. Virtue is knowledge. They're identical for Plato, basically. If you know that... If you have two choices and you know that one of them is just and the other one is unjust, you will choose the one that you know to be just. This might sound ridiculous because we talk about, even if you know the right thing to do, sometimes you don't do the right thing. He would counter and say, no, you do always do the thing that you think is the best thing for you to do. Sometimes you still value your own sort of benefit over justice. And it's a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of understanding the superiority of the form of justice over your own personal sort of satisfaction and things like that. So, knowledge, but hand it to Plato a little bit. He's talking about knowledge in a way that we don't often talk about knowledge because we live in the mathematical scientific age of knowledge having a very specific meaning. Whereas he had a different, very specific meaning when he talked about knowledge. But I think it's interesting to talk about this consensus. I would posit, in my gut reaction, that I haven't thought about this for more than a day. Well, I mean, I have, but since reading first Alcibiades now, I haven't thought about this a ton. I would say yes and no. I think we still ought to be teaching our best understanding, even if there's not real, proof for it. But our best understanding of something, I do think we should teach it. And I do think we should teach it as our best understanding. I am convicted a little by this to be, maybe a little more clear at times, to say things like, we don't know this for certain. This is our best understanding now. But to make it clear, as I'm teaching, I teach high schoolers, but as I'm teaching, in the various ways that I am an educator, to be a little more, a little more upfront. So oftentimes I'll say things like, this is how this works. And it is, as far as we know, 90% of the time in Latin, or in our knowledge of ancient history or philosophy or things like that. But there isn't 100% consensus because we're not 100% certain about everything. And I think this is a good thing to keep in mind, is Plato's philosophy involves walking into everything trusting. Walk in believing something, but with an open enough mind to let reality change your understanding. It's the opposite of science, in a sense. And I say opposite not as though they're opposed, but they complement each other. The natural science is you walk in assuming nothing. You walk in with no belief. You walk in a sense, disbelieving until you see it happen. Or disbelieving until the math says, oh, here's a thing. You try not to impose an understanding on something beforehand. In philosophy, if you walked into all of philosophy assuming nothing, you would stop very quickly and get no further than Descartes, whose whole philosophy is based on what can I absolutely know for certain and reject everything else. And, well, he comes up with a list of 3 things. No one lives their life as though they only know 3 things. And for Plato, it's you walk in assuming that things are the way you thought they were. And then you ask questions, you probe and say, really? And you go from there. In science, you walk in assuming nothing is, that we have no preconceptions. Let's start putting stuff together and see what happens. And you build knowledge from the ground up. In Plato, you kind of almost filter knowledge from above. And I think it's good to keep that in mind with the way we teach. and the way that we learn. Assume, unless it's a mathematical certainty, assume that everything you know, whether you're teaching it or learning it, assume everything you know is not the whole picture, but it is towards the picture, in a sense. It's a sign of the picture. It's pointing towards the full reality, which is only really comprehensible in eternity, in the forms. You know, maybe you don't know, because you haven't read a lot of Plato, but like the forms are these, the ultimate ideas of the ultimate realities of things, and everything that we touch and feel and taste and see and hear and smell and all of that. All of those are sort of the shadows, as Plato calls them, in the cave. And understanding comes from understanding the forms. And so you can't, you know, I can only know so much about this paint and that paint and that paint without knowing paint, you know, what it is and how it works and what's all about it. And then suddenly I'm illuminated greatly as to what paint is. And so I think it's important to keep our eyes on the forms, it's important to keep our eyes on those sorts of things, but also just to realize that we don't have a full understanding of really anything. And it's a journey. You know, even for the teachers, there's always more. And for the students, there's a lot more. Walk in trusting your teacher, but also walk in knowing that your teacher doesn't know everything. Trust that they know more than you in general, but also know that there's more. And it's okay for a teacher to change their mind. They might teach one thing and then come to a better understanding and then change that. That happens. It ought to happen. If your mind is never changing, it means you're no longer growing. So, those sorts of things. Well, I'll keep this video short. I only got to one thing in the whole first Alcibiades, so I guess even first Alcibiades is a series already. So we'll go from there and further. I have 4 more things I want to talk about in first Alcibiades, so we'll get to them. Thanks so much for joining me in this series on Plato's Dialogues. If you'd like to see the previous video in this series, click up here. If you want to see the next video in this series, click over there. And if you want to see more content like this, go ahead and click subscribe.